This is Mind Blown.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
Hello and welcome to Mind Blown, the podcast where we explore fascinating topics about nuclear weapons to challenge our understanding of the world. We're your hosts, Olamide Samuel and
Vincent and Intondi.
And today we are delving into one of the most contentious and consequential events in history, the development and the use of the atomic bomb during World War II. Today we'll be discussing various aspects of this topic, so let's dive right in. So Vin, why did the United States develop the atomic bomb during World War II?
Thanks, Ola. Before we get into that important question, I'm going to take us a step backwards. Let's kind of go back before we go forward. If I asked you who was President Roosevelt's vice president before Harry Truman, do you know?
I actually never thought of that. No.
Most people, a lot of people don't. And definitely most kids growing up don't learn this. And it was Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace, he was part of the New Deal programs and working on the South and agriculture for FDR. And Wallace becomes vice president and is probably to this day the most progressive left-leaning vice president in United States history. This was also somebody that never really bought into the whole Washington kind of scene. He would talk about Longhouse religion and Buddhist religion, and he would play with his boomerang on the Potomac versus kind of drinking and having cigars at the Capitol. And he was actually loved by the American public. He was loved by FDR. But the British and the French absolutely hated him because he would rail against colonialism. And Southern whites hated him because he spoke out so much against racism. And male chauvinists hated him because he spoke out for women. And so I say all this because going into the 1944 election, FDR was physically weak. He was sick, obviously, from polio. And the party bosses in the Democratic Party knew that FDR probably wouldn't make it through his third term. And they did not want Wallace to become the president of the United States if FDR passed away in office.
With the Democrats divided, party leaders were searching for a compromise. Party chairman Bob Hannigan wanted neither Wallace nor Burns.
My father and the other political advisors felt that Jimmy Burns would be a liability to the ticket. Southerners were a drawback at that time. Labor was not particularly fond of him. And my father was very concerned about Wallace as a possible president. He felt that he was sort of flaky. And from a politician standpoint, my father couldn't control him.
And so they needed to find a replacement. And the person that replaced him was none other than Harry Truman.
Oh, wow. So compared to Wallace, who was Harry Truman?
Quite the opposite. And it's funny because when it comes to Truman, we have this nostalgia of him. You know, when he left office, he had approval ratings that were so abysmal. now he's widely viewed as one of the greatest presidents that we ever had, with, the buck stops here and so on and so forth. And that's partly because, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who Bush credits with, quote, telling me everything I know about the Soviet Union, named Truman her man of the century for Time magazine. You have biographies written by, those like David McCullough and others that have kind of lionized Truman and put him up on this pedestal. But the reality is, Truman was woefully unprepared for the job. And if you go back to when he was a child, Truman had a problem with his eyesight. So he had these big, giant Coke bottle glasses. And he used to get his butt kicked all over the playground. He would really get bullied a lot in elementary school. And his father, when he would come home, his father would often say to him, "Oh, that's okay, Harry." Or his mother would say, "Excuse me, that's okay, Harry. Your father always wanted a daughter, and you're the daughter maybe he never had." And his brother Vivian was the one that was actually, the tough guy in that regard. Actually, he serves in World War I, and that's, you could argue, his greatest moment. As he's a good soldier in World War I. And then when he comes back to his home state of Missouri, he bankrupts businesses. He's not a good businessman, can't keep anything together in that regard. And then he ultimately tries politics. And how he gets into politics is what's known as the Pendergast machine. So a lot of times you hear about Chicago politics, like the machine, Boss Tweed back in New York City. And it's these party chairmen, these treasury secretaries, these kind of things, they kind of run the show. Boston politics of who's going to get elected. And in Missouri, his name was Tom Pendergast, and he was the Pendergast machine, if you will, was the one to try to get him a judgeship and try to get him elected. And they had handpicked him to get him in the Senate. And that's how he gets started. Now, Truman also was not the most racist president we've ever had in history. That probably was Trump, but certainly one of the most, right? Truman, if you go through his letters to his wife, Bess, or his personal diaries, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. He actually writes to his wife. Yeah, he writes once to his wife, Bess. He says, quote, "I'm strongly of the opinion that Negroes ought to be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white men in Europe and America. I guess it's race prejudice." He would tell interviewers that, his grandparents were slave owners. And he would say, "Oh, yes, they had slaves. Well, they brought them here from Kentucky, and most of the slaves were wedding presents. When a couple got married in our family, they got a few slaves to start out the housekeeping with." His mother openly supported the Confederacy and said that when she thought it was good that Lincoln got shot. And when she visited the White House, said she would rather sleep on the floor than in Lincoln's room. He also sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to join. And they sent it back to him because they said he refused to fire some of his Catholic workers in his business, so he couldn't join. And so we'll talk about how much of a role his racism played in the decision, but there's no question that he had this deep-seated racism, already within him. And so, go ahead. I can see the look on your faces.
He had remarkable pedigree for being the ultimate racist, if you ask me.
Yeah, and so, but we don't talk about this because we usually say, well, he desegregated the military, so how could he be racist, right? So that's usually the get out of jail free card he gets. Now let's cut to how he gets to become vice president. And this is a story that is absolutely remarkable. It's mind-blowing, no pun intended. And I guarantee you most of our listeners have, including possibly you, have never heard of this story. So it's actually called Pauley's Coup. And it's named after Edward Pauley. And Edwin Pauley was the Democratic Party treasurer, and he was an oil millionaire. And Edwin Pauley used to famously say that it's easier to buy an entirely new Congress than to bribe the old one. That was his MO. In fact, Pauley Pavilion, for those of you listening that are sports fans, UCLA's pavilion is called the Pauley Pavilion. This is who it's named after. And so there were a whole bunch of people that were involved in this plot to get Truman in power. So it was Edwin Pauley, and then it was also Edward Flynn, who was from the Bronx, Mayor Edward Kelly of Chicago, Mayor Frank Hague of Jersey City, and others. George Allen, who was the party secretary, and National Democratic Party Chairman Robert Hennigan. So there were a group of these party officials that were plotting to make sure Truman was going to become the vice president. So they essentially could control him. If FDR passes away, they got their guy in the White House. So back then, if you think about the conventions that we have today, right, they're largely parties. You nominate the person, but they've already picked their vice president. People give speeches, the balloons fall. But back then, there were real delegates and there were real horse trading going on and all of these types of things. So we're going to pick this story up at the 1944 Democratic Convention. Okay? On the day of the convention, on July 20th, 1944, Gallup ran a poll of Democratic voters and who they wanted to be the vice president of the United States. And 65% wanted Henry Wallace, the guy that the people loved. 2% wanted Truman. And FDR was too ill to really get in this fight, but he did say that had he been a delegate, he absolutely would have voted for Henry Wallace. And so the day of the convention, they had planned on nominating Truman, but while this was happening, they made a mistake and they let in all of the Henry Wallace delegates into the convention hall. And as this is happening, a spontaneous demonstration started by Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey erupts in the hall. And everybody starts chanting Wallace's name over and over again. Wallace, Wallace, Wallace. Well, as this was happening, there was a Florida congressman, a Democrat. His name was Claude Peppers. They used to call him Claude Red Peppers. And he was in the back and he saw what was happening. And he was thinking to himself, if I can get to that stage and I can get Wallace's name and nomination, he'll be the vice president again. And if Truman passes away, he's going to be president of the United States. And so he starts pushing people out of the way, saying, get me up there, get me to that stage. And at the same time, Mayor Edward Kelly of Chicago, who's part of this, sees him coming. He sees what's happening. And he knows that he's got to get out of this. And so he says, okay, there's too many people here, so we're going to have to adjourn. There's a fire hazard. All in favor of adjourn, say aye. Silence. All in favor of a continuance, say aye. All the ayes ring out. Well, now Claude Pepper has gotten to the stairs, and he's 5 feet away from the microphone. He's right there. And Kelly says, we've got to cut the power. We've got to cut it. There's a fire hazard. They cut all the power, and they end the convention for that day. The next day, they got all the votes in, and on the third ballot, Truman finally gets it on the third ballot. Why is that important? Why am I telling you the story? 5 feet away. Had Claude Pepper gotten Wallace's name and nomination, he would have been the vice president again when Truman died. He would have never dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No Cold War, no Vietnam. The entire course of human history would have been changed in those 5 minutes. And most people growing up in the United States have never once learned of that story. Mind blown?
Wow. Mind obliterated. Absolutely. This was a democratic coup of epic proportions with all of the tricks in the book, including cutting the power off. You know, the last time I heard of anything like this was never. I haven't heard of a coup like this, especially one with such epic ramifications for the course of world history. Mm-hmm. This is remarkable.
So now we cut to April 12th. April 12th, 1945. Truman is brought into a room at the White House. He rushes over. He had been hanging out at the Capitol and drinking and things. And Eleanor Roosevelt says to him, Harry, the president is dead. Truman was so stunned, he almost passed out. He composes himself and he says to her, is there anything I can do for you? And Eleanor says, is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one who's in trouble now. He noted that he later began to cry, thinking about, quote, the awful responsibility he had. When he got sworn in, he said, boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. He wrote, I felt like the moon and the stars and all the planets had fallen on me.
People are always asking me how I felt when I learned that I was President of the United States and that President Roosevelt had passed away. There are some facts I think you ought to know that have not been told before. You see, I never did want to be vice president.
I felt like I had been struck by lightning. And when Senator George Aiken of Vermont, he told him, "I don't feel that I'm big enough for this job." In fact, one reporter yelled out to him, "Good luck, Mr. President." And Truman responded, "I wish you didn't have to call me that." And earlier that evening,
Wow.
he was finally told by Secretary of War Henry Stimson that the U.S. was building, quote, "the most destructive weapon in all of human history." That shows two things. One, FDR so little trusted Truman, he never told him we were building the bomb. This is the first time Truman's learning about it. And second, the idea that Truman didn't know how destructive it was, that it was just another weapon of war, that doesn't hold up. Because for the first time he's being told about it, he is being told, quote, "it is the most destructive weapon in history." So you ask me, why did we develop the bomb? And
Yes.
the answer to that, of course, was to stop Germany. It was never intended to be used on Japan. When U.S. scientists found out that two German scientists had split the atom in December of 1938, the fear was that Hitler was going to build a nuclear weapon and that he was going to use it. And so we had to develop a bomb to stop Hitler. But remember, we dropped the bomb in August of 1945, and Hitler was dead in April of 1945, before the bomb was ever used. And of course, yes, and of course, say what you want about Putin now and the actions in Ukraine, but the reality is that back then, the Russians did the yeoman's work in defeating the Nazis. 27 million dead. They were the ones that first stopped the Nazis. It wasn't, the U.S. and the Allies until later. And so now Truman is faced with the biggest decision of his presidency, arguably the biggest decision of mankind. He writes in his memoirs in 1955 that on the first full day of his presidency, Secretary of State Jim Burns told him, quote, "the U.S. was building an explosive great enough to destroy the entire world." Over and over again, he's being told by his cabinet officials that if he uses this weapon, he will end life on the planet. He's being told. And yet he not only authorized the use of the atomic bombs in Japan, always insisted that he felt no remorse, even bragging that he, quote, "never lost any sleep over the decision." In fact, when he was briefed on the July 25th, 1945 test, the atomic bomb test, the Trinity test, he writes, quote, "it may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark." That's what he's comparing it to.
Wow. No regard from what his perspective was, the end of the world.
Right.
Because there was no prior test or detonation to show that this would create a chain reaction that would envelope the entire world. And he essentially trivializes it and even welcomes it and adds it to his pre-existing beliefs. That is ludicrous.
The way that we learn about this is that it was the right thing to do. It ended the war quicker. It saved millions of American lives, all of these types of things. But let's start to kind of unpack some of those things. One of these things is the idea is that it saved millions of American lives. And the argument behind that is that the Japanese were going to fight to the death, that they had kamikaze fighters. There was just no end in sight. We had firebombed them before this. We killed 80,000 alone just in Tokyo before. We were island hopping. In fact, our firebombing was so devastating that Henry Stimson at one point said to Truman, "if we don't stop, we are going to outdo Hitler on the reputation of atrocities." That's how bad it was. So, and the idea was the Japanese were just going to keep on coming. Okay. And so the narrative is it saved 1 million lives had we gone in a ground invasion. Let me explain why this is complete nonsense. That number has been completely inflated. In fact, the Joint Chief of Staff, the military planners at that time in 1945 estimated that had we gone in a ground invasion, the most casualties we would have had would be 193,500. However, the War Department, our War Department, which kind of like DOD now, in 1945 looked at Japan's defenses and predicted that the most we would have would be 46,000 Americans killed. Yet, Truman insisted in 1955 that it was 500,000 lives that we had saved. And then
tenfold.
Yes. And then Henry Stimson said it was over 1 million. And then George H.W. Bush said it saved millions, plural, of lives. And this number continues to go up and up and up without any facts behind it. But the reality was that that wasn't the case if you look at what the Japanese military was at that time.
From 46,000 from a realistic assessment to millions. So there's clearly a discursive justification going on that relies on the inflation of American casualties to justify the same event decades even after it occurred. And my question to you was, since they're trying to justify the use of this bomb, do you think that the atomic bomb was necessary to end World War II?
Good question. And the answer is absolutely not. So again, let's kind of put this all together and go through it. After the Battle of Saipan in July of 1944, Japan took so many casualties. They were in such bad shape that they started to look for ways to get out of the war. The Tojo government had fell, and the new government developed an unfortunate policy of let's try to get one more military victory and then we'll sue for peace and strengthen the surrender terms. But they never got that victory. And so then the planning of one last kind of U.S. invasion where they could take heavy casualties and negotiate these surrender terms. But the reality was by the end of 1944, Japan's Navy was decimated. They had lost 7 out of 12 battleships, 19 out of 25 aircraft carriers, 103 out of 160 subs, 31 out of 47 cruisers, and 118 out of 158 destroyers. Their military was obliterated from us. And in fact, the former prime minister of Japan sent a letter to the emperor in the summer of 1945 saying, quote, "I regret to say that Japan's defeat is inevitable." And so Japan created a new strategy, which was diplomatic. They wanted to get the Russians maybe to intervene on their behalf, who were neutral in the Pacific at that time, and they were looking for a way out. So the next question becomes, well, how do I know this? How do any of us know this, right? Maybe, what is the evidence? Well, the evidence is that the U.S. cracked the Japanese code, and we started intercepting their messages. We were intercepting the foreign minister Togo in Tokyo and Ambassador Sato in Moscow. Well, what were they saying to each other? What did the U.S. know before we dropped the bomb? One memo that we intercept says, quote, "Japan is deeply reluctant to have any further blood loss on both sides. It is his desire for the welfare of humanity to restore peace with all possible speed." Over and over again, we were intercepting messages where they were putting peace feelers out and they were trying to find an end to the war. They wanted out. There was no way that they could sustain this any longer. And the point is, we knew that before we dropped the bombs.
We were so intent on dropping these bombs that we refused to even recognize an orchestrated message from Japan to the world that they were open to negotiations. I wonder why the US was so hell-bent on using the bomb. Was it that there were no other ways to end the war without using the atomic bomb?
Well, we don't want a Monday morning quarterback, and maybe none of these things would have worked in the end for surrender. But my thing is, wasn't it worth trying certain things? And one of them, we could have certainly demonstrated the bomb. We could have said, this is what's waiting for you if you do not surrender, right? That's one possibility. The second thing is changing the surrender terms. Japan was already militarily defeated, but Truman in the United States was hell-bent on unconditional surrender. FDR had accidentally made that pledge at Casablanca in front of Churchill. And what that meant was that when the U.S. won, the Emperor of Japan would be tried as a war criminal and executed. And General Douglas MacArthur in the summer of 1945 told Truman that, do you understand that executing the emperor, who is this Christ-like figurehead in Japan, it would be like crucifying Christ in the United States. They will die like ants for him. But if we change the surrender terms and let them keep the emperor, we can end this war right now, right? That's the sticking point. So just let them keep the emperor, change the surrender terms, and this war would be over. But Truman says no, because again, Truman, who now knows that we have the bomb, now he's the big man on campus. Now his chest puffed out when he sees Stalin. Now he's arrogant. No, it's unconditional surrender. And of course, the irony here, the rub here, is that after we drop the bombs and kill hundreds of thousands of people and start this awful process that we all live with now, we actually let them keep the emperor anyways. So we could have done that beforehand and ended this war sooner. Yes. So why was it used? I would argue a couple reasons. One, revenge for Pearl Harbor. Two, flex our muscles to the Soviets to say we have this new weapon now, right? And then three, we can talk about, Truman's own deep-seated racism and what that meant in his decision and, what it meant to killing all these people.
That is a kaleidoscope of possibilities to explore. But I think the last part, in terms of Truman's deep-seated racism and his perspective on, the sanctity of human life across the world, I think we should explore that further. So what was President Truman's reaction after the bomb was dropped?
So Truman, of course, when he finds out what happened, the first thing he did is jump in the air and say, this is the greatest thing in history. Okay. Well, Truman writes, quote, "The final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me. Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt about it should be used." In a letter he wrote to his sister in 1948, "I ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I made the decision." When he was interviewed and asked about if it was a morally difficult decision to make, he said, quote, "Hell no, I made it like that," and snapped his fingers. When he was asked by Edward R. Murrow in 1958 if he had any regrets at all, quote, "Not the slightest in the world." And we all saw that scene if you watched Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer is in the president's office and says, "I feel like I have blood on my hands." He's filled with all this guilt. And as they show in the film, Truman says, angrily says, "I told him the blood was on my hands and let me worry about this." And then told Dean Acheson, "I don't ever want to see that son of a bitch in my office again." And another time he called him a crybaby scientist. And there's one story where Churchill was visiting and he was with Truman and he sees Truman. He's in this really happy mood, drunk, gloating about what had happened. And he says to him at this party, "Mr. President, I hope you have an answer ready for that hour when you and I stand before St. Peter." And he says, "I understand you two are responsible for putting off those atomic bombs. What have you got to say for yourself?" And Truman gets flush red, doesn't know what to say. And Robert Lovett, his Secretary of Defense, kind of intervenes and saves him from the embarrassment. But up until his death, he constantly said that he was okay with the decision, that he made the decision and would do it again.
Wow. He really owned that decision voluntarily and also trivialized the decision by snapping his fingers and saying, "I'll do this again," and it happened like that. This is remarkable and also draws some parallels with some world leaders we have today, and also the continuing prejudice that continues to color, perceptions of world leaders and many publics, especially in the global South. I also have another question, and this was, besides Truman's own reaction, what was the public's response to the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb?
Well, before we get to the public, let's take a step back and look at our own military. Like, before we get to all those peace doves that we hear about, right? All those people that are, ideologues that don't want the bomb. Well, the first thing was that the military knew that this was really about the Soviet Union, right? And in fact, it was, because the bomb did not end the war. So you've asked me, could the war have ended sooner? Yes. You asked me why we developed it, not to be used on Japan. And when we look at, did it save 1 million American lives? No. And now, did it end the war? And the answer to that is also no. What ended the war was Russian entry. Again, the Red Army is what everybody feared because they had seen what the Red Army did to the Nazis.
It isn't very often that we are able to show in our newsreel pictures of the fighting on the Russian front. But this is an example of the kind of assault that has carried the Red Army to the gates of Prussia. The objective in this Soviet offensive is Tarnopol. And tactics employed were those that have realized many victories on the Eastern Front. The once invincible Nazi army continued its advance backwards towards Berlin.
And so the Soviets, when they announced that they are coming into Manchuria, entering this part of the war, that's what finally gets the Japanese to say, we're done because we can't fight against them as well. And again, Truman knows this. Truman is told when he finds out, he says, this is Truman's words, quote, Stalin will be in Jap war on August 15th. Finny Japs when that comes about. He tells his wife, quote, the Soviets are coming into war and it will end a year sooner. And our War Department has a report on June 30th that says the entry of the Soviet Union into the war will finally convince the Japanese of the inevitability of complete defeat. On April 11th, the Joint Chiefs of Staff says, quote, the USSR comes in, they are done. Japanese intelligence, we intercepted a message that said, quote, the Russians coming in will be the death blow to our empire. And we know that the Japanese army minister was told that the Americans have 100 atomic bombs and Tokyo is next, and they were prepared to keep going. What ultimately got them to stop was when the Soviets entered on August 9th, and August 14th, they surrender. So the bomb did not end the war. It was Russian entry that ended World War II in the Pacific. Now, you asked about what was the response. Let's look at some of these military folks. Admiral William Leahy, who chaired the meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and served as Truman's personal chief of staff. Here's what he said, quote, it is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. Dwight Eisenhower. I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon. Air Force Chief of Staff General Henry Arnold wrote, it always appeared to us that atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were on the verge of collapse. General Curtis LeMay, who oversaw the entire firebombing campaign, quote, even without the atomic bomb, the Russian entry into the war, Japan would have surrendered in 2 weeks. And I can go on and on of military experts that warned Truman, that told him, you do not need to do this. We can end this war. And again, this is the military calling for this.
This is astonishing. Why is it that we get this narrative today about the irreplaceability of the nuclear bomb in ending World War II? What does this narrative seek to achieve in today's politics?
Well, if the goal is to continue to build more of these and have money for our defense and money for weapons manufacturers, you need to have a narrative that there is a necessity for this type of weapon. The other thing is, when there's certain lessons that come out of World War II, which are very dangerous. One is that war rejuvenates capitalism coming out of the Great Depression, right? The New Deal got kind of the car out of the ditch, but it was the war effort that drove it and got it going again. And so if there's a need for a war, in fact, during the Korean War, a real important lesson was learned that I think it was General Van Fleet speaking to a delegation that said, we now knew there was a Korea somewhere in the world. That as long as we were fighting communism or under that guise of communism, there would be something that we could build, a Defense Department, a CIA, an NSC, all of this structure, which of course, when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989 and now there's no more communism and this whole industry was based around that fear and around that whole thing, it was very convenient to now just take out the word communism, put in the word terrorism, and now you got a need again for all of this, kind of thing. And the other piece and this is something I noticed with students over the years, is that They feel that if they criticize the decision to use the bomb, it's somehow insulting their grandparents or great grandparents that stormed the beaches of Normandy and died in this war. And so trying to explain to them that you can still commemorate your loved ones and talk about their valor in D-Day and these things, but at the same point time criticize the decision, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's another piece of this. You asked about the public's response before
Public response, yes.
Yeah. Well, Gallup had a poll less than a week after the atomic bombing that showed that 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. Roper ran a poll that showed that 22% of the American public had said they wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And in fact, no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American people criticizing Truman's decision. And that's because in this country, the Americans had a race hatred, a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that is unprecedented, far worse than the hatred we had towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11 or people of Asian descent with COVID. And we're very careful in our literature and our newspapers and our conversations to separate Nazis from Germans and Italians from fascists. But when it came to Japan, the whole country was guilty for Pearl Harbor. And so all of the images coming out of the US media at the time were of the Japanese being yellow monkeys and roaches and vermin. And this plays into, of course, the racism piece, which is if you reduce a group of people to being an other, being less than human, subhuman, it makes it easier to commit violence against them because you're not killing mothers and daughters and, fathers and cousins and students. No, you're using a bomb on these vermin, on these yellow monkeys, on these roaches. And we do the same thing with Korea, with Vietnam, with the Iraq War. It's always the same thing. We see this today with Hamas. They're animals in Palestine. They're all terrorists. We see that same language. When we say that undocumented folks are aliens, they're not, then they're no longer humans, right? Illegals. Then it's easier to say electrocute them on the border, drown them in the Rio Grande, because again, they're not humans that we're putting in cages. No, they're animals. And so this was the same kind of thing. So the American people, by and large, agreed with this. And that doesn't change until John Hersey's book comes out, Hiroshima, because that book was the first to really put a human face on these people. Right? The 6 survivors he focuses on, and it got people thinking, oh my God, this could actually happen to me, and really think about the human consequences of this. But that's why, and of course, nothing's monolithic. Many in the Black community didn't have this initial response because many in the Black community already had an affinity for the Japanese before the bombs were dropped. They had seen that when then Mussolini and Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, it was actually Japan that publicly came out and said they were going to come to the aid of their, quote, colored brothers and sisters. The Black community saw Japanese internment in the United States and said, wait a minute, here's a group of people that are being put in these outdoor prisons for no crime they committed, but just simply what they look like. This could happen to us, and actually try to sneak food and things like that into those internment camps. You have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was lionized in Asia and was writing about it in the Black press. So some of that was already built in before the bomb was ever dropped, which made the Black community's response quite different from the general American public. We don't learn this narrative. The reality is that Truman put a process in place that he knew what he was doing and yet did it anyways. It's because of that we now live with the idea that we can all die from nuclear war because of this process. And, our buddy Henry Wallace, who I mentioned in the beginning, Truman actually keeps him on as Secretary of Commerce, but Wallace keeps speaking out against the bomb. And Truman gets so upset that he finally just fires him. And in the second term, just surrounds himself with yes men.
I think we have a lot to chew on in this episode, and we have a lot that we're going to continue to question on the Minds Blown podcast. And thank you very much, Finn, for your insights.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, after the atomic bombs were dropped and all of this destruction and hell happened and the war is over, we are faced with this decision of where do we go from here? As the U.S. largely being the victors in World War II. And this is one of those moments in history where, again, as a historian, I look back and go, this is one of those times I wish I could say to you, Henry Wallace was the president, and because Henry Wallace always wanted to take some of the better things communist nations were doing, the good things that capitalist nations were doing, put them together and have peace. That's what he wanted. But we don't have that. And if there's ever a clear kind of fork in the road, Henry Luce, who was a publishing magnate, he wrote editorials in Life magazine, he published in Time and Fortune, he was very well respected at the time. In 1941, he wrote an essay called The American Century, in which he said, quote, "We must accept wholeheartedly our duty and our opportunity as the most powerful and vital nation in the world, and in consequence to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence, for such purposes as we see fit, and by such means as we see fit." So what was he doing? He was calling for an empire. He was saying the U.S. is going to win this war, and we are an empire, and we should be able to do whatever the hell we want, whenever we want. Well, a year later, Henry Wallace wrote an essay in response, and it was called The Common Man.
Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering, the century which will come out of this war, can be and must be the century of the common man. If we really believe we are fighting for a people's peace, all the rest becomes easy.
And what Henry Wallace said was, I say the century which will come of this war can and must be the century of the common man. No nation will have the God-given right to exploit other nations. There must neither be a military nor economic imperialism. Imagine, had we taken that track, what the world would be like. It's like saying, imagine if JFK had lived because he wanted to get out of Vietnam and he wanted to end the Cold War and he wanted to end nuclear weapons and make peace with Khrushchev. Imagine if RFK had lived, who wanted to get out of the Vietnam War, right? There's these moments in history where we say, man, things could have been so different than they are today. And those 5 feet where Claude Pepper, if he could have got to the mic, how that would have changed the entire narrative, the entire world, and where we are today.
The course of world history in 5 feet.
I just want to make sure that before we wrap up, Ola, we give our book recommendations.
Book recommendations, yes.
And so mine will be to stick with this. If you want to know where a lot of this information comes from, you want to read it yourself, I would start with, let's say, Ronald Takaki's book, Hiroshima. It's a short book, but a lot of these things are in there, as well as others. But if you're not familiar with this narrative, that is one that I would start with, is Ronald Takaki's Hiroshima.
I would say, instead of a book recommendation from my end, to really humanize the discussion, I would recommend a speech from 2017 by the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Setsuko Thurlow, who was actually a young woman when this bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think it's a very powerful recollection of the impact of dropping the bomb and what humanity still has to do to ensure that there is no other use of a nuclear weapon in war in the future.
Yes, I will co-sign that 100%.
And with that, we have come to the end of today's episode. We hope you enjoyed our insights, and we hope that you join us next time on Minds Blown as we explore other captivating topics that look at the connectedness between nuclear weapons and our day-to-day lives. We thank Lex International for their continuing support, and to our listeners, we see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And goodbye.
We were in the huge wooden building on the second floor, 1 mile away from the ground zero. And then at 8 o'clock, we started the morning assembly. And when Major Yanai was speaking to us, giving us the pep talk, then suddenly I saw the bluish white flash. And I still have the sensation of floating up in the air. And when I regained the consciousness, I found myself in the total darkness and total silence. And I tried to move my body, but I couldn't, so I knew I was facing death. Then I started hearing faint voices of my girlfriends around, and they were asking for help from their mothers, from their God. And then somebody's strong male voice said, "Don't give up, don't give up, keep pushing, keep kicking. I'm trying to free you." So with this man in the dark, I was rescued. I was able to come out of the building, but most of the 30 girls were burned to death alive.